My name is Brett Kabler, and my presentation is on the Triassic Extinction. So, just a little bit of background into it. It was one of the five mass extinctions in history. It's actually the third largest, in which 80% of species alive at the time were lost. The other mass extinctions are the Ordovician Silurian era, which occurred 443 million years ago. Then the late Devonian extinction. So, in this one, about three-quarters of all species ended up dying out. Then the third is the Permian mass extinction. It's the greatest mass extinction in history. It's actually known as the Great Dying, and 96% of all species died out during this mass extinction. So what's kind of interesting is that all life on Earth today kind of descended from those, like the 4% that survived. And then of course the Triassic extinction, the one I'll be talking about, and then the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction, which is the one that most people know about, the death of the dinosaurs and the giant meteor. So, a little more background on the Triassic extinction. So, there were many types of animals that died, mostly marine life, reptiles, large amphibians, and reef building creatures. Roughly half of all the species alive at the time became extinct, and plants, however, were not too badly affected. So there's really no clear cause as to like why this happened. However, scientists kind of believe that it was a combination of a few different factors. So the first is the Siberian trap eruptions, which is a chain of volcanoes up in the northern continents at the time. So basically, it was a mass eruption between all of these, and it polluted the air, and then the pollution in the air rained down and spread into the oceans, which caused something called anoxia, which is essentially when there's no oxygen left in the ocean. So, combination of the pollution from the eruptions spreading into the oceans kind of is why so much of the sea life was affected um, during this time. So, as I mentioned before, anoxia was one of the biggest factors in this extinction. So, like I said, it's essentially when the seawater is depleted in oxygen. Um, Scientists and geologists believe that that's the main reason for all the extinction that occurred in the ocean. Um, so, it starts where it's deeper in the ocean and gradually builds up to the more shallow parts. It's even so prevalent today in places like the Baltic Sea and even the Gulf of Mexico. Um, it was about 50,000 years until our oceans actually returned to how they were before the extinction. And it may have actually taken 250,000 years for the coral reefs to fully recover around the globe. So, taking all that into consideration for how much time that it took for this to occur, it was really devastating to see how long it took for Earth to recover. So one of the biggest reasons that we had this in the ocean was because of a burst in volcanic activity about 200 million years ago, and this really increased the carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere. These were known as Siberian trap eruptions, which is like I said before, the chain of mountains up in the northern continents that, as they exploded and erupted, released a very large amount of pollution into our atmosphere, which I'll get into later. So, lastly, about anoxia, it was well known that anoxic water played a key role in the Triassic extinction, but it wasn't really until very recently that geologists and scientists kind of discovered how crucial of a role that it actually played. Um, so another really big part that kind of goes along with anoxia in the ocean, scientists say that ocean acidification played a pretty tremendous role in the mass devastation during this extinction. So in order for a couple of geologists to understand it a little bit better, they decided to, just verify that the oceans were very acidic during the Triassic extinction. And so a team of geologists collected ancient rocks that were once part of the seafloor during this time. Um, it's actually really rare to find seafloor rocks from the Triassic period because at this point they've pretty much been recycled back into the mantle due to plate tectonics. So the fact that they were actually able to find samples is pretty incredible. So essentially, what they did was they tested the boron isotopes within these rocks that were once part of the seafloor, and so they wanted to reconstruct a record of like the pH of the seawater at the time of this mass extinction during the Triassic period. And so after a couple years of finding samples and then figuring out how they were going to do it, they narrowed it down and discovered that during the Triassic extinction specifically, um, there was a large drop in pH, so their assumptions were correct. It was, in fact, more acidic within the ocean during this time of extinction. And it was at this time in Earth history that marine organisms began to perish at a very high rate. And also, organisms that contained calcified shells um, were just devastated at this time. So, that's basically how anoxia and ocean acidification really kind of led up over a long amount of time due to the Siberian trap eruptions. So those are kind of two crucial aspects that make up this mass extinction. So getting into the catastrophe itself a little bit more specifically, it's really important to actually understand what really happened with these Siberian trap eruptions that I keep talking about. So in detail, really, it was just a mass eruption that kept occurring for over 2 million years. So if you can imagine the amount of pollution that that would put off. So there was an insane amount of CO2 that was building up in the atmosphere, and it was in a world that was already experiencing different forms of global warming. So these volcanoes were putting off insane amounts of CO2, like I said, and then also, as we know, it's just a part of like in the last 100 years, or starting in the Industrial Revolution, igniting coal and burning coal adds a lot of pollution to our environment, and there were mass amounts of coal that had been deposited under these volcanoes. Um, and so when these volcanoes ignited or erupted, they ignited the deposited coal underneath them. And so when these were ignited, they released twice as much pollution as they really even should have into the atmosphere. And this led to so many more things, mercury poisoning, other toxic effects that were just devastating. And then flood basal eruptions. It was just a large-scale eruption which occurs on land or on the ocean floor, and it may continue to erupt for thousands to millions of years, kind of like the Siberian trap eruptions. And it covers hundreds of thousands of kilometers, whether it's through lava flows or CO2 within the environment. So there was so much sulfur dioxide gas that entered the lower stratosphere of our atmosphere that it actually significantly reduced the amount of light that reached the Earth's surface. And so, although there were many places where climate change made it to where it was way too hot for life to exist, there were also places where the temperature would decrease and photosynthesis couldn't occur within plants. And so, as you can imagine, that just caused a whole lot of different problems. But getting into more climate change, all the greenhouse gases within the atmosphere cause temperatures to rise significantly in most places. And then specifically places in the tropics were just way too hot to sustain life. It was impossible with the temperatures being that way and the humidity. So climate and CO2 have actually been doing this throughout most of geologic time. But Earth's climate system has a way of kind of going through a process to where it can maintain stable climate. However, there was so much CO2 and other toxic gases being released into the atmosphere at the time that it actually caused global warming via the greenhouse effect, and it was just too much at one time. So this actually had the ocean surfaces that were turning acidic, and it caused the oceans to warm up And so then sea levels began to rise, and it just caused a whole lot of different problems. And we're actually seeing similar problems today due to pollution, obviously on a lot less smaller scale, but it's still significant enough to where it's raising questions. So, to wrap things up, the Triassic extinction occurred because of a couple different factors. The main reason being the significant amount of CO2 that was released into the atmosphere after the massive Siberian trap eruptions. Um, it polluted oceans and caused temperatures to rise significantly all over the Earth. So, together, these factors combined to form the third largest mass extinction in Earth history.